that we live in an oligarchy where corporations have more power than ordinary voters. Maybe we don't want to be fighting to change that at all points. Maybe there are some points where we just have to play along, but still, we need to keep our eyes on the prize and remember that rolling back and restricting corporate power is part of building a better democracy. And that's as true in the realm of LGBT rights as elsewhere. I'm very much afraid that US-based human rights organizations and LGBT rights organizations are exporting this model of using corporate power for our own ends to movements in the global South. And I think that's a very ominous thing. I don't think activists in South Africa or India who have achieved remarkable victories on their own need to be taught by American activists that, well, what you need to do is just get Coca-Cola on your side. I certainly don't think that activists in other countries need to feel that the US model of using money to achieve social change is the only model or the best model around, where it's a substitute for actual political motivation, political mobilization of affected communities. Politicized people can do a lot more still to achieve social change than politicized corporations. And we need to work on raising the political consciousness of people, our people, and not so much on trying to instill a kind of fake political consciousness into powerful corporations.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very, very good. Excellent. And the next, you've done a lot of really amazing work in Egypt. I've actually learned a lot personally from your writings about human rights in Egypt, because this is something I used to be extremely wrong about. I'm wrong about plenty of things. This is probably the most wrong. Whereas I figured the government they had now was very good, probably better than the alternatives, etc., etc. And it was quite ridiculous. And then I was reading your stuff and it became other people's stuff, and I was like, it isn't actually. So can you explain that, why I was wrong, and what the situation is on human rights in Egypt, and who some of the Egyptian activists are who are trying to change this, and how we can support them?
Well, to start with, tonight is May 10th, 2021, and tomorrow's the 11th of May, and tomorrow is the 20th anniversary of the raid on the Queen boat in Cairo, when police raided a floating discotheque in the Nile that had a lot of gay people attending it, and they arrested 52 people, and it became a gigantic show trial that dominated the Egyptian press for months, and I think also became a perfect example for other governments about how you could use sexuality to incite the kind of moral panic I was talking about earlier in a country of expanding inequality and injustice. So it's kind of a significant anniversary for me. 20 years ago, I also knew nothing about Egypt, really. I was working in my office late at night, and I was contacted by someone whose roommate had been arrested in the Queen boat raid, and I started getting more and more information from Egypt, and it became ultimately a country that I've been involved with for a good 20 years of my life, and feel very close to. I feel very close to the activists and the advocates who have worked there. I've been profoundly moved by their strategies and their work across the whole field of human rights and the range of human rights issues. So 20 years after that, 20 years after the Queen boat raid, I would say Egypt is in a very dire state. There's a military dictatorship that has taken from the Arab Spring the lesson that you should never allow any dissent or any space of difference in society. You should just repress, crack down, brutalize, and torture. That's the essential strategy of the current regime toward every everybody and every issue. They've used LGBT issues once again as a wedge issue to shore up their own political support. I do think it's striking, and this gets at what you were saying. I think that for 1 year, Egypt had an elected government under an Islamist party, the Muslim Brotherhood, from 2012 to 2013, when it was overthrown in a coup. And there was a general expectation, particularly in the West, that the Islamists are in power, they're going to start arresting LGBT people right and left, and that didn't happen. In fact, it was probably the freest period for queers in Egypt that there's been in decades, that single year, as well as one of the freest periods in Egyptian history. Now, part of that freedom came from the fact that it wasn't a very competent government. It wasn't in control of its own police. It wasn't in control of its own security forces. But also, at least in terms of LGBT issues and women's issues to an extent, they didn't have to prove anything because they were Islamists. They didn't have to prove their religious credentials by enforcing morality because everybody knew that they were a religious party. And I think there is a lesson in that often groups who are suffering from moral stigma or religious stigma can be more endangered by a secular government which has to prove its religious street cred than by an ostensibly religious government. I'm not sure that's universally true, but it was certainly true in Egypt, and the brutality of the current government has reinforced that. The most important thing for me about Egypt, though, is the many activists I've known there over the years. Activists for LGBT rights, activists for human rights more generally. I have really vivid memories of during the build up to the Gulf War in 2003. Every week there were demonstrations against the war and against the Mubarak government somewhere in Cairo. And usually it was 40 or 100 people who would be completely surrounded and kettled in by 2,000, 5,000 security forces armed with rifles and machine guns. And to be there with them was terrifying. I was constantly impressed by their courage and
no, you froze again.
continue. Sorry?
I'm sorry, you froze again. Just like
okay. All right.
My apologies, internet's been not great for a while.
Yeah, that's fine. Just let me know when I can start.
Now it's good.
Oh, okay. Well, I was continually impressed by the courage of the activists who were organizing these demonstrations. I was continually impressed by the fact that, they were putting their bodies on the line. They were engaged in a very direct kind of challenge to the state, which was, okay, we are going to go out and we are going to demonstrate as if we lived in a free country. And that gives the state two choices. Either it could arrest us and crack down on us, in which case it's shown that it's lying that we don't live in a free country, or it can actually let us demonstrate, in which case we will have expanded just a little bit. We will have pushed a little farther the envelope of what citizens are actually permitted to do under dictatorial rule in Egypt. And that kind of activism means putting your body on the line every day, spiritually and physically, against the state, and a challenge to the state to show what kind of government it really is. And activists in Egypt, democracy activists, human rights activists, have been doing that for 20, 25, 30 years. Some of the people who pioneered that kind of activism like the human rights lawyer Saif al-Islam, have died. Some of them, like Saif's son, Alaa Abdel Fattah, are in prison now. And no one knows when they'll be released. Some of the activists, like Hossam Bagat or Ida Saif al-Dawla, are under criminal investigation for doing human rights work and banned from travel. A lot of LGBT people and young LGBT activists have simply left the country because they saw no hope and no future there. But in one way or another, I think they still keep the faith and keep the fight going. Hossam and Ida, even though they can't leave the country, still do their activism on the web. Alaa is in prison, but his family still sends out messages about his situation and about prison conditions and about the abuses he and others are undergoing. And the young queers from Egypt who are scattered around the world now, from New Jersey to Amsterdam to Berlin to Thailand, they also, whenever they can, they organize demonstrations and try to raise voices against the Sisi regime and its barbarities is not too strong a word. I do think as long as they keep fighting, there's hope for Egypt, although it's not hope which is immediately obvious. The kind of fascism I spoke of earlier, the fascism of limited opportunities, the fascism which preys on people's sense that their own hopes are dead and that there's nowhere to turn, that fascism is now completely dominant in Egypt. But I don't believe it can last forever. I really don't.
Thank you. Amazing. Thank you very much. Let's see. I remember another really good essay you wrote about the Egyptian activist Yara Salam on the difference between human rights activism and feminism. And you said human rights activists want to change the rules of the world, and feminists want to change the world itself. And this is a direct quote, really good. That feminists want to have new players in a new game on a different, still dormant field. So clearly, we need both modes of activism. I remember you also said that it's not just, oh, the feminists over here. Oh, now my connection was bad. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Perfect. I remember you saying it's not just, oh, the feminist over here do this, the human rights activist over here do that, but the feminist approach and the feminist mode of desire is essential to human rights activism. And can you tell us why?
Yeah, well, a lot of human rights activism and a lot of human rights work is about the rules, right? Human rights often presents itself as being above politics and as about simply setting the rules for a better, fairer politics. And no, I don't think we should underestimate the importance of that. There is a utopian element in that. Just to imagine a world in which everyone has full freedom of speech, everyone has full freedom and autonomy over their bodies, is to imagine a world very different from the world we live in, a world which, approaches the utopian in the possibilities that it opens up. And yet, I do think that not every form of activism, not every form of progressive thought, not every kind of hope needs to be subsumed under the banner of human rights. Human rights has become very hegemonic, I think, over all our political imaginations, really since 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, when a lot of the organized left decided that what I think Jean-Francois Lyotard called the grand narratives of history, of progress and liberation, no longer really worked. And we needed a new kind of narrative that would explain what we were fighting for, and human rights became kind of the default narrative for progressive dreams. But it's not the only one. Thinking about liberation, thinking about a liberated society, a liberated economy, the liberation of our desires, of our bodies, of our imaginations, is different from at least the standard rhetoric and the standard strategic